IPC, and welcome to Term 5. For those of you who haven't gotten to meet me yet, my name is Michael Stanley. You can call me Mr. Stanley. And today, for our very first set of assignments in IPC, since this is a science class, I figured a great place to start is how scientists think about, observe, and ask questions about the world around them, otherwise known as the scientific method. So those are the notes that I'm going to be talking to you about today. All right, so scientific method, all about how scientists think and act about the world around them. So it's a series of steps that scientists use in order to come up with questions and then get good scientific answers to those questions. So there's observation, noticing, and finding out things around you, coming up with a question that you might have about that observation, developing a hypothesis, which is like a prediction or a guess, doing an experiment to test your hypothesis, test your guess, collecting data on what is it that you're measuring, what are you finding in your experiment, reaching a conclusion. So what did you find and how does it relate back to what you thought you would find with your hypothesis? And finally, going through the process again, making sure that your results are consistent across multiple pieces of experiments. And so all of these are what we're going to be looking at in a little bit more detail today, kind of step by step. So the first thing that a scientist does is they observe things. So these are observations gathered through your senses. It doesn't just have to be sight, even though that's what most people are familiar with. You can use any one of your 5 senses in order to observe. So things like smell, touch, hearing, taste, and sight. All of those are your 5 senses that you can use to observe things. And so science is all about the natural world. So we're using these observations to observe things in the natural world, stuff about plants, animals, air, water, all sorts of interesting things like that. So, for example, maybe you're out on a stroll through like a nature park. Pretend like there isn't a global pandemic going on right now and people are allowed to come and go as they please in Austin. And you notice that you come across a whole bunch of salamanders, which are like lizards that live around the water. So they're small, 4 legs, big long tail. Normally, they're supposed to be fairly straight, kind of just like a lizard's would be. But these guys have weird curved tails. So instead of being a nice kind of straight long tail on a normal lizard, these guys have weird kind of crinkly curvy tails. That's weird. That's not what salamander tails should look like. This might lead you to a hypothesis. What is causing these salamanders to have this weird set of tails? So a hypothesis is a suggested solution to the problem. You notice something, you're wondering about it, and you want to see if you can figure out what the answer is. So a couple important things about hypotheses. First off, they have to be testable, meaning that it can't be something based in like religion or science fiction or mythology. Like you can't say, I hypothesize that we have lightning bolts because the Greek god Zeus is sitting up on his clouds and throwing the lightning bolts down at us. Sure, that's great if you want to think that way. There's no really way for us to test that hypothesis. There's no way that we could gather evidence about whether or not the Greek god Zeus throws lightning bolts down at us. So it has to be something that we can accomplish in the natural world as humans, as scientists. Sometimes we can write these hypotheses as if-then statements, meaning that you can say, if I see this weird thing going on in my environment, then I think this is the cause. If I add more fertilizer to my plants, then I think they will grow bigger and have bigger flowers. So you can kind of set it up like that. The important thing about hypotheses is that they are a prediction. Sorry that all my drawing and shapes look weird. It's really hard to draw with just a mouse on your computer. This isn't a touch screen, so I can't go on like with a pen or something. So a hypothesis is a prediction. You're predicting what you think will happen or what you think is causing the observations that you're seeing. So with like the plant example, you could predict that you give plants more fertilizer and more water, they'll grow bigger and have better leaves, better flowers. You're making a prediction. So an example of a hypothesis could be that these salamanders that have these weird, curvy, crinkly tails, it's due to pollution. So you think your guess as to why the salamanders have the weird tails is that there's pollution in their soil, pollution in their water, and that's causing them to grow up with the weird messed up tails. This is a hypothesis. You're guessing or you're predicting what you think is causing these weird tails. You don't know that for sure. It could be anything in their environment, but your guess, your prediction, your hypothesis is that it is pollution. So you've made your hypothesis, you have your guess, and as scientists, obviously, we don't want to stop right there because we want answers, dang it. We want to know. That's why we're scientists. We want to know stuff. We want to figure out the answer to our question, to our guess. That's where the experiment comes into play. So the experiment is the actual procedure that you go through in order to test the hypothesis. You think that pollution is causing the salamanders to have weird tails? Great. How are you going to show that? How are you going to prove it to other people who don't think that's going on? You need information that you can give them, and you get that information by doing an experiment. So when you're creating an experiment, there's things called variables that you have to keep in mind. These are factors, aspects of the experiment that can change. So things surrounding your experiment or in your experiment itself that might not stay the same the whole time. And today we're going to talk about 3 different sets of variables that scientists need to keep track of in order to have a good, thorough experiment. So, in order to set up a true, good experiment, then we can only have one variable that changes. One variable that doesn't stay the same over the course of the experiment. So say, for example, we're doing our experiment with the salamanders. We think that pollution is causing them to have the weird tails. So we set up 2 different groups. One group is set in a room that's kept at a nice 75 degrees Fahrenheit. They have a day-night cycle in their room, meaning that the lights go on during the day and turn off at nighttime, almost as if they were out in the actual wild. And they have clean water in their tank. Or we set up a second group where we put their room at 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Their lights are always on, so we keep the lights on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And they get the pollution water. So if these guys grow up with the straight tails, and these guys grow up with the weird curvy tails, then you might be tempted to think, oh, these guys had clean water, these guys had pollution in their water, therefore it must be the pollution that was causing the change in their tails. But that's not the only thing that was different. These guys with the curvy tails also had the lights on all the time. Maybe that contributed to the tails. They were kept at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so really, really hot in their room. Maybe the heat caused some difference with the tail. We don't know based on this experiment, what caused the tails to grow weirdly in the salamanders? Because we have so much that's different from our original experiment over here. So in order to have a good experiment where you, at the end of the day, can have a clear answer on what caused the change in your groups, you can only have the one changing variable. So if we set up these two groups again, but we made both groups be at 75 degrees, and we made both groups be on a day-night cycle, but the only thing we changed is that one group had the clean water and one group had the pollution water, and then we saw a difference in the tails, that would be a much stronger evidence, a much stronger case that the pollution is what's causing this change, not any of these other things that we kept the same. So a good experiment, we only change one variable at a time. So these variables that we change, the variables, that one variable that we change, the variables that we keep the same, and the variables that we measure, each have a specific name that's going to be important for you guys to know. So in each experiment, we change one factor, like we just said, and then we measure or we observe what happens due to that. We change the pollution being in the water, and then we measure how many salamanders grow up and have weird tails. So these are our first two different variables, what we change and what we measure. So the independent variable is the variable that we change, the factor that we change in the experiment. So this would be like the pollution in the water. This would be giving plants fertilizer or not giving them fertilizer. That is the independent variable. What the scientist is changing at the start of the experiment. So it's what the scientist has control over. What we, as the scientists or experimenters, are changing over the course of the experiment. As the experiment is going on, we're taking lots of measurements, right? We're watching changes happen with our salamander tails or our plant growth, and we're measuring what those changes are. And that is the dependent variable. So it's whatever is measured or observed over the course of the experiment. So whatever it is that we're measuring, either you're measuring how far something travels under different conditions, how much weight that an animal or a person gains under a certain diet, how tall somebody grows over the course of their lifetime, how many salamanders end up with the weird tail, how tall our plants grow if we give them fertilizer. These are all our measurements that we're taking in our experiments. And these are all our dependent variables. So these are our first two variables that scientists have to think about for an experiment. The variable that you change, or your independent variable, and what you measure, or your dependent variable. The last set of variables that scientists have to think about are grouped into one overall group called control variable. So anything that is not our independent variable or our dependent variable is a control variable, something that the scientists want to keep the same or keep constant so that they don't affect the outcome of the experiment. These are things that we do not want to change between our groups. These are our control variables. So in the salamander example, we said that we wanted to keep the temperature the same between the two rooms, and we wanted to make sure that they had the same amount of light and darkness for daytime and nighttime. Those are control variables. Those are things that we don't want to change between our two groups because they might mess up our final measurements, our dependent variable. If we're doing an experiment with plants and we want to see how much fertilizer helps them grow, we want to make sure that they get the same amount of water, the same amount of sunlight. They grow up in the same temperature. They're planted in the same type of soil. All of those are control variables, things that scientists keep the same, keep constant between all of the different experiments that they're doing. So we have these controls because we're not trying to test the temperature effect on salamander tails or the lighting effect on salamander tails. We want to test the pollution effect on salamander tails. So by keeping the same amount of temperature and sunlight for each salamander group, we can compare between the two, see how many grew up with straight tails, how many grew up with curved tails, and from that, learn about what is the role of pollution and having salamanders grow up with their weird tails. So we're comparing between our groups because these controls are all the same. All right, so let's do a little example to kind of get you to think about how you can identify controls and variables in a very basic experiment. So let's say that we were still going to school. Let's pretend like it's a magical world where we can go back to school. And that you get home from school every day the same way. This says walk home, but I know for most people, you probably drive home from school. So we'll pretend like it says driving instead. So every day when you leave from the Excel Center, you get home the same way. You go the same route in your car each time. One day you decide, maybe there's a faster way to get home. Maybe I can get home even quicker if I go a different way home. So you decide for 1 week, you're gonna change how you get home from school. You're gonna take a different route each day to see what's the fastest route in order to get from the school to your house. So each day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you're gonna drive a different way from school to your house. And you're gonna time how long it takes you. So you're gonna measure if I go my normal way versus this different way versus this other way. You're gonna stop the stopwatch on your clock on your phone as soon as you walk out of school, or you're gonna start the stopwatch as soon as you get in your car from school, and you're gonna stop it as soon as you park in your driveway or in your apartment. So each time you go home, you're gonna measure how long did it take you. And then you're gonna use the same car, so you're gonna use your car. You're not gonna borrow a friend's car, or like your uncle's van or your brother's bike or motorcycle. So it's just gonna be your car, the same car that you're familiar with and you drive every day. That's how you're gonna drive. And some of your friends hear about this and they wanna help you. They wanna say, oh, I can drive my car from school to your house and see how long it takes. Get you some more data. You don't wanna do that either, because maybe they drive different than you. Maybe one of them is a really fast driver who tends to speed and not always stop for a stop sign. And maybe some of them are like one of my friends from Ohio who are super slow drivers that drive very cautiously and very slowly everywhere. It's the worst. So you don't want any of those people messing up your experiment. You're gonna do all the driving yourself, and you are going to use the same car each and every time. So from this, I'll give you guys a couple seconds to think about what is our independent variable in this experiment, what is our dependent variable in this experiment, and what are some of our control variables. Think about it for a couple seconds, and then I'll go through the answers. So what are the different variables in this experiment? What is it that you're changing as the scientist, you're independent? What is it you're measuring, the dependent? And what are some of the things that you're keeping the same? All right. Had enough time? Let's check it out. So, independent variable is the thing that you, as a scientist or experimenter, are changing between the different experiments. So in this case, it would be varying the route or changing how you get home from school. So you take a different route every day, and by doing that, you're creating the independent variable. You're changing how you get from the school to your house. How long it takes is the dependent variable. So remember, dependent variable is what you're measuring in the experiment. In this case, you're measuring how long it takes you to get from the school to your house in each different way. And so this is your dependent variable, the time spent driving. Finally, our controls are things like keeping the same, well, this says walker, but remember we pretended that was driver. So the same person driving the car each time, that's you. And the same car being used each time, that's also you, your car. These are our control variables. These are the things that we are keeping the same between all of our different experiments. It doesn't matter which day of the week it is, it's always going to be you driving, and it's always going to be you in the same car. So for a good experiment, you need to keep track of your independent variable, your dependent variable, and your control variables. So you've done all these experiments, you've measured all of your dependent variables, and these measurements make up your data, the results of your experiment, right? If you're doing this experiment multiple times and you didn't write anything down or didn't record anything, then what's even the point? You don't have any answers. So you need to be keeping track of your data, of your results, in order to see how your measurements stack up against your hypothesis, your guess from earlier. So this data could be made up of numbers, which it usually is. So things like the number of seconds that it took to get home from school, the counting how many salamanders ended up with the weird tails, or measuring how tall that a plant grew when they were given plenty of fertilizers. You could also have qualitative data, which are things that are not numbers based. Things like, did you see a color change while your experiment was going on? Was there a weird smell that started to give off during the experiment? These are more things that you'd notice in kind of like a chemistry type of experiment. So you use your data, you use your results to reach your conclusion. So your conclusion is the answer to your hypothesis based on these results. So it's essentially a makeup of what did you find, what are your final results, and is your hypothesis supported? So do you support your hypothesis? Is it were you right in your initial guess? Or is your hypothesis not supported? Were you completely off base from what you guessed earlier to what you actually found? So in our salamander example, you could say that either the pollution did cause, we had way more salamanders in the pollution group have the weird crooked tails versus in the clean water group. This supports our hypothesis because we thought that pollution was causing the crinkly tails. We found a lot more curved tails when we put salamanders in their pollution water. Or you could say, I thought that getting home from a different way than I normally get home would be faster. I tried all these different routes, and on all of them, the time I spent driving was longer than the run that I normally take to get home. In that case, my hypothesis was not supported. I thought that it was going to be faster to go a different way, but as it turns out, I should just keep going the same way that I've been going. This is your conclusion, your final results that you found, and how do they relate back to your hypothesis. So finally, if you want to be a really good scientist, you're going to run your experiment multiple times because you want to make sure that you didn't have some sort of random freak accident that caused you to get totally different results than what you might normally get. So like if you try to do that driving experiment right now during the middle of this COVID pandemic, you'd probably get home a lot faster than you used to because nobody's on the road. So that wouldn't really be a very good experiment because it wouldn't show you the real results. You'd want to do multiple tests all during kind of the same conditions, the same time of day as a normal way when you're going to school. So that way you can verify your results, show that you didn't have any random outliers in your data that are throwing everything off, and that all of your results line up with each other and all agree on the same thing, whether or not it's faster to drive the same way home or a different way home. So, in review, in order to work their way through the scientific method to solve a problem or a question that they have, scientists first identify a problem and make observations about it. Something in their natural world makes them interested, so they observe different things in order to try and figure out what the problem is. You use those observations to form a hypothesis about the problem, so a guess or a prediction about what you think is going on. You then design an experiment in order to test that hypothesis. So you set up your dependent variable you set up your independent variable, the thing you're going to change between your experiments. You get ready to measure your dependent variable, and you make sure that all of your control variables are being kept the same between all of your experiments. As your experiment is going on and you're taking measurements of your dependent variable, you're collecting data, so you're writing this stuff down in order to go through and look at it later. Once you do that, you can reach your conclusion. You can find out whether or not what your final answers were and how does that relate back to the hypothesis. So your data gives you your final results for your conclusion, and then you can use those final results in order to say whether or not your hypothesis was supported or not supported. And then finally, if you want to get really, really good results, you're going to do this experiment multiple times in order to figure out, do I get the same results each time? Or is there something very, very different that's happening that maybe means that I'm not controlling one of my control variables well enough? So that is our scientific method. That's how we go through and try to determine answers to questions that we might have as scientists. And so for your assignment for the first, this kind of first real week of classes, now that we've gotten everybody onto the Google Drive, is going to be looking at different areas that people are in terms of working on their own issues through the scientific method and trying to figure out which part that they are at. And so the worksheet looks something like this. So for each one of these questions, it's describing a step of the scientific method over here. And so you're going to want to match each of these sentences, each of these scenarios, with one of these listed steps of the scientific method. And so these steps, A, B, C, D, all kind of go in order. So A is recognizing a problem or making observations having to do with developing some kind of question that somebody is wondering about or interested in. B is what you'll put if somebody is forming a hypothesis, which again is a guess or a prediction about their question, what they think the answer to their question might be. C is for if they're actually setting up and doing an experiment in order to test their hypothesis. So for example, It describes different steps that they're taking, maybe some of the independent variables and the control variables that they're setting up. So basically kind of giving you a step-by-step overview of the experiment that they're doing. And then D is drawing conclusions. So they've reached the end of the scientific method. They have their experiment finished, they have their final data, and they're sharing their final data with us. So their data is showing, or their data is demonstrating some sort of answer to their question. And so for each one of these sentences, it's up to you to match it with the step of the scientific method labeled over here. And again, you can either, if you have the ability to print this out and write it down, you can do it that way, or just write down 1 through 15 on a separate sheet of paper. And then for each one of those numbers, tell me if A, B, C, or D fits the best. And then as always, you take a picture of it and you can either text it to my work number or email it to my email address or upload that picture directly to the assignment on the Google Doc. All those are equally good ways of sending me your assignments and your answers. So hopefully you guys found that helpful. If you have any questions, you can email or text me or call me at any time, or feel free to drop in on one of our office hours that we have going during the week, because that's what they're there for me to help answer your guys' questions. Hope that you find this stuff not too difficult. If you have any questions, let me know. Now I'll see you guys next time for the next set of notes and assignment.